The morning of her sister's wedding, Daniela Ashworth carried a stack of pressed linens through the east corridor of Carew Hall, while a woman in ivory silk laughed somewhere above her on the grand stair. She did not look up. She had learned, in the weeks since her mother had installed her here under the quiet designation of useful relation, that looking up was the one luxury she could not afford. The linen smelled of lavender and hot iron. The corridor was cold despite the season, the stone floors of Carew Hall holding their chill the way old houses held their grievances, deep and patient and thoroughly indifferent to the people moving through them. What she did not yet know was that a man was watching her from the doorway at the corridor's end, and that the quality of his attention was nothing like what she had been told to expect from the Duke of Ashmore. She had been told he was cold. Her mother had said it with a kind of satisfied precision, as though coldness in a duke were a feature of the appointment rather than a failing of the man. Cecily had said it with a small, wrinkled nose, the way she discussed weather she found inconvenient. Daniela had formed her own understanding of the Duke of Ashmore over the past 4 months, though she had formed it from absence rather than presence, from a series of letters she had written, and which had never received a reply, from the slow realization that the replies had not, in fact, failed to arrive, but had arrived and been redirected, and that the hands that had redirected them belonged to her mother. She had not confronted her mother. There was no profit in confrontation when one was £4,000 in debt, when one's father was 6 months in the ground, when one's only protection against a contested estate and a creditor's patience was the goodwill of the woman controlling the household. She had learned to carry linens instead. The corridor ran the full length of the east wing, and she was nearly at the servants' stair when she heard the footstep. Not the light, rehearsed footfall of a housemaid, or the quick-capped step of a footman with a tray. This was slower, deliberate, the stride of a man who had decided to stand exactly where he was standing, rather than arrived there by accident. She looked up then. He stood at the foot of the servants' stair in a coat the color of charcoal, his cravat precisely knotted, his face the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with ease. He was not a tall man in the way that announces itself. He was tall the way a room is tall when all the furniture is low. By proportion, by contrast, by the sense that the surrounding space had organized itself in relation to him. His eyes were the gray of river water in November, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately name. Edmund Carew, Duke of Ashmore, looked at her the way a man looks at something he recognizes from a considerable distance and did not expect to find this close. Daniela tightened her hold on the linens. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped a curtsy that was correct in every particular, because she had been raised in a household that did not forgive imprecision even when it was forgiven everything else. He did not move. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was exactly as described, level and contained, and carrying the authority of a man who had spent considerable energy learning not to require volume. "You are carrying linens." It was not a question. She treated it as one anyway. "Yes, Your Grace." His jaw shifted, the smallest possible tightening, and then it was gone. He stepped to the side of the stair to let her pass, and as she climbed the first step, he said, without inflection, "Those should be carried by one of the maids." "Yes," she agreed, and continued up the stair. She did not hear him follow. She did not hear him leave either. She told herself that the heat across her collar and the odd precision of her own breathing were products of the morning's exertion, and she believed herself almost completely. The wedding was not until noon. That left 4 hours in which Carew Hall, all 47 rooms of it, required the kind of preparation that Mrs. Eunice Ashworth had decided her elder daughter was best placed to manage. The flowers for the long table in the dining hall had arrived in the wrong shades of pink and needed to be sorted by a person with sufficient taste to correct the arrangement without insulting the florist. The card table in the south drawing room had developed a wobble that the footman had so far declined to address. 3 of the 31 invited wedding guests had arrived the previous evening and required their rooms attended, and the elderly widow, Mrs. Penworth, had lost something and was being gracious about it in a way that made Daniela more concerned, not less. She found Mrs. Penworth in the blue sitting room, turning out her traveling case with the calm determination of a woman who has been misplacing things for 80 years and has made a philosophy of it. "I am quite certain it will appear," Mrs. Penworth said without looking up. "My late husband's mother gave it to me at my own wedding, and it has appeared every time since." She folded back a silk wrapper and set it aside. "It is only a cameo brooch. Small. The frame is gold. The figure is alabaster." Daniela studied the case and the room. The room had been occupied that morning by the florist's assistant, who had brought in and removed 2 vases and a length of ribbon. She crossed to the occasional table near the window where the ribbon had rested, moved the empty vase, and there, behind the vase's foot and against the wall's paneling, sat the cameo. Not stolen, then, only displaced. She picked it up and carried it to Mrs. Penworth. The elderly woman's face arranged itself into an expression of deep, uncomplicated relief. She closed her fingers over the brooch and pressed Daniela's hand briefly. "You are a good girl," she said. "What is your name?" "Daniela," she said. "I am glad it was not lost." She did not wait to be thanked further. She had not done it for thanks, and staying to receive what she had not sought felt like a kind of dishonesty. She was nearly at the door when Mrs. Penworth said, behind her, "Your Grace would do well to know your name, I think." And Daniela did not understand what the old woman meant, and put it from her mind, and went to see about the wobbling card table. What she did not know was that the Duke had entered the blue sitting room from the connecting corridor 30 seconds after she had entered it from the hall, and had stood behind the half-open interior door and watched the entire small transaction in silence. He had seen her study the room with the attention of a person solving a problem rather than performing a service. He had seen her find the cameo in the one location the other searchers would have overlooked. He had watched her place it in the old woman's hands and leave before the old woman had finished exhaling her relief. He had stood there for a moment after she was gone, and something that had been locked at a particular angle in his chest shifted without his permission, and he breathed once, slowly, and went to the window and stood there. Outside, the grounds of Carew Hall were green in the June light. The lake was visible from this window, a long flat sheet of silver between the trees. He had not looked at the lake without deliberate effort in 7 years. He looked at it now without noticing that he was doing so, which was the first sign that something about this morning was different from the mornings that had preceded it. The ceremony at noon was brief and beautiful, in the way of ceremonies that have been designed by people with money and executed by people with taste. Cecily Ashworth, dressed in ivory silk with seed pearls at the collar, walked the length of the Carew Hall Chapel looking like exactly what she was, a woman who had been prepared from birth for this particular moment and had found the preparation entirely adequate. The Duke stood at the altar with the focused attention of a man completing a necessary proceeding. He did not look toward the chapel's south wall, where the household staff and the family's marginal relations had been arranged in a row, and where Daniela stood in a gray mourning dress with her hands folded and her face composed. She had accepted the seating arrangement without comment. Her mother had explained it as a matter of practicality, the chapel's north pews being required for the titled guests, and practicality was the language in which her mother conducted all negotiations she would rather not name plainly. Daniela had accepted it and taken her place on the south side and watched her sister marry the Duke of Ashmore, with a quiet and genuine wish that the thing might go well for them, despite the particular shape of the road that had brought them to this altar. At the wedding breakfast, the 31 guests were arranged at a long table in the dining hall, and Daniela was not among the arrangements. This, too, had been explained as practicality. There were not places enough, her mother had noted. Someone must attend to the household. She had said it in the light, bright voice she used when she was delivering instructions she did not intend to justify, and Daniela had understood, and had retreated to the corridor outside the dining hall with the faint mechanical calm of a woman who has learned to manage the space between what she feels and what her face is permitted to show. She was standing in that corridor with a tray of empty champagne glasses when the dining hall's door opened and the Duke stepped out. He looked at the tray. He looked at her face. His expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness did. In a way, she was becoming, against her better judgment, able to read. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Your Grace, I am attending to the glasses. You are not a housemaid." "I am whatever I am required to be today," she said, and kept her voice level, because she had not intended to say something honest, and she was not going to compound the error by following it with resentment. Something crossed his face too quickly to name. He stepped back through the doorway and said something in a low voice to the footman stationed inside, and 3 minutes later, that same footman appeared in the corridor and took the tray from Daniela's hands with a brief nod, and the Duke reappeared in the doorway and held it open. "Come in," he said. It was a command. She read it, as she was learning to read all of his commands, as something other than what it sounded like at first hearing. She came in. A chair had been produced near the end of the table, outside the main arrangement of guests but inside the room, and a plate had been filled with the sort of care that suggested someone had been watching what she had not yet eaten that morning. She sat down. Across the table she could feel her mother's attention, like a hand pressed against glass, and beside her mother, Cecily's new diamond earrings caught the candlelight, and Cecily watched the Duke return to his seat with an expression Daniela recognized as something between satisfaction and calculation. But the Duke did not look at Cecily as he sat. He looked at Daniela once, briefly, and then at his own plate. And the look had in it neither warmth nor coldness, but something that felt, in her chest, uncomfortably like being seen. If you have been following Daniela's story, leave a word below. The thread is just beginning, and the room has not yet decided what it will do. The afternoon passed in the long particular way of afternoons that carry more beneath their surface than their surface reveals. The guests walked the grounds in small parties. The new Duchess received congratulations with the bright facility she had been raised to deploy. The Duke moved through the rooms of Carew Hall with the deliberate economy of a man in his own house, attending to his guests with precision and without apparent pleasure. Daniela found Agnes in the kitchen passage just after 3 o'clock. Agnes had served the Ashworth household since before Daniela was born, and had followed Mrs. Ashworth to Carew Hall for the wedding in the capacity of extra kitchen help, a capacity she occupied with the particular dignity of a woman who has survived long enough to stop being embarrassed by necessity. She was small and white-haired, and had a way of watching things that suggested she catalogued them without commentary, reserving judgment for occasions when it might be of practical use. "Sit a moment," Agnes said, without looking up from the pot she was tending. "You have not sat since 6 this morning." Daniela sat on the low stool beside the kitchen fire. The warmth was immediate and specific, and she let herself have it. Outside the kitchen windows, the afternoon light was beginning to go golden, the particular gold of late June that makes even stone look briefly warm. "Agnes," she said after a moment. "Did you know the late Duchess?" Agnes was quiet for several seconds. "I knew of her," she said at last. "She was a guest here, at a summer party, 7 years ago. Not yet his wife then, but nearly. There was a gathering in the evening, out by the lake." She moved the spoon in the pot with careful attention. "He and she quarreled that night. The guests said afterward that he left early, went up to the house angry, and she stayed by the water with the others." She set the spoon down. They found her the next morning. The kitchen fire popped. Daniela looked at her own hands. "He has not forgiven himself," Agnes said, not as a judgment, but as a fact she had long since filed among the fixed properties of the world. 7 years is a long time to carry a thing like that. Daniela thought about the window she had passed that morning, the Duke standing before it with the lake visible beyond the glass, his back to the room, the particular set of his shoulders. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the corridor, with an expression that was not warmth exactly, but was the complete opposite of dismissal. She thought about the letters she had written to him last autumn. Careful letters, letters with actual thought in them about the management of the Ashworth estate, and the question of the entail, letters she had addressed to him directly because her father had told her, in the weeks before he died, that the Duke of Ashmore was a man who answered honest questions with honest answers. Her father had known Edmund Carew years before the title fell to him, had trusted him in the specific way that men trust each other across an honest business transaction, and it had been her father's express wish that she write. She had written. The letters had not been answered, and she had grieved that, quietly, among the other small griefs of that winter. She understood now that they had been answered, only not by her. She stayed with Agnes until the supper preparations required Agnes's full attention, and then she went upstairs. She passed the empty hall where the portraits hung, and stopped. Her father's portrait had been hanging in that hall when she arrived at Carew Hall 3 weeks ago. She had noticed it then with a complicated feeling she had not examined. The picture of the man who had once conducted honest business with this house returned now to some kind of peripheral position in the story. She had looked at it and thought that it meant something, though she could not have said what. It was gone now. The hook was bare. She stood looking at the bare hook for a moment, and then continued up the stair. In the drawing room, her mother was explaining to the wife of a baronet that Daniela was our useful relation, the phrase carried with the smooth ease of long practice. The baronet's wife made a sound of polite understanding that managed, without apparent effort, to convey that she had made the necessary social calculation and found it satisfactory. Daniela, crossing the room with a message for the housekeeper, passed close enough to hear every syllable. She had been hearing some version of that phrase for 4 months. The first time had been at her mother's morning room table in October, when her mother had told the solicitor that Daniela would be taking on the household accounts, in her useful capacity. The second time had been at the Ashworth's neighbor's card evening, when her mother had introduced her to a new acquaintance as our useful relation who manages these things for us. This was the third time, and each had landed in the same place, with the same small specific weight, the weight of being named by what you do, rather than who you are. She delivered the message to the housekeeper and went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and breathed for approximately 45 seconds, which was all the time she could afford. The evening drew the guests toward the drawing room and the dining hall in its natural social rhythm, and Daniela found her way, as she had found her way for 3 weeks, into the corridor between those 2 rooms, which was where she was most useful and least visible. Lord Prentice Farwell, Cecily's previous suitor, who had arrived that afternoon with the easy confidence of a man who believed his past proximity to a titled family conferred ongoing relevance, had been in the drawing room when Daniela passed through it. He had looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has discovered something he intends to use. She had not understood the look immediately. She understood it better later, when the drawing room had grown loud with after-dinner conversation, when the candles had been lit in multiples along the mantelpiece, and when Lord Farwell stood up. He had a letter. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way rooms go quiet when they sense that what is coming will require their full attention, voice by voice, face by face, until the only sound was the fire. Farwell held the letter as though its weight were greater than paper. He addressed the room in the practiced voice of a man who had rehearsed a public moment and found the rehearsal insufficient preparation for his own satisfaction. The letter, he said, had been obtained through considerable effort and personal cost, and its contents bore directly on the legitimacy of certain members of the Ashworth family who had attached themselves to the present occasion under false pretenses. He looked at Daniela when he said false pretenses. He looked away when he said it, which was the specific cowardice of a man who wants witnesses but not consequences. The letter claimed that Daniela was not George Ashworth's legitimate daughter. It cited a date. It cited a correspondence. It was very specific in the way that fabricated things are specific, with the manufactured particularity of a document built to convince rather than to record. Daniela's hands were still. She was sitting at the room's edge, as she had been sitting all evening, and she was aware of the 31 faces turning toward her, and she was aware of her mother's face going the color of old plaster, and she was aware of Cecily's hand tightening on the arm of her chair. She did not speak. There was nothing true that she could say at this moment that the room would receive as true, because the room had already decided what kind of thing she was, and a woman named a servant in all but title does not stand up and contradict a lord with a letter. Her mother said, in a voice stripped of its usual precision, "This is quite unnecessary." Lord Farwell said that on the contrary, he felt it was very necessary indeed, given that certain financial arrangements connected to the Ashworth estate and its debts of £4,000 might be affected by questions of legitimate inheritance. The Duke of Ashmore's face went still, not cold in the way it had been described to her, not remote and managed. Still in the way that water is still in the second, before the current underneath it asserts itself. Agnes was in the room. Daniela had not seen her come in. She was near the door, in the shadowed part of the room between the last candle and the threshold, and she was looking at Lord Farwell with the expression of a woman who has been cataloguing things for a long time and has decided this is the occasion. "I was present at that child's birth," Agnes said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I held her. I dressed her. I carried her to her father. And he wept over her, as a man weeps over something he loves and has been given without deserving it. The date on that letter is wrong by 3 years, and the name of the midwife named in it has been spelled incorrectly, which is a small error for a man to make about a woman who was present at his own birth, as she was present at mine." The room received this. Lord Farwell said, "An old woman's recollection is better than a lord's forgery," Edmund Carew said. He had crossed the room. Daniela had not seen him move, only the result of his moving, the 3 strides that had brought him from his position near the fireplace to the center of the floor, and then to the space directly in front of her, and then, in a motion that stopped every breath in the room, down. He knelt on the polished floor of his own dining hall, in front of his own wedding guests and his own new wife, and his own house's assembled hierarchy. And he looked up at Daniela Ashworth with an expression that was the opposite of cold. That was, in fact, the most specific and direct and costly look she had ever received from another person. "Miss Daniela Ashworth," he said, and the use of her full name in that order, given name first, deliberate and chosen, was its own kind of declaration. "I wrote to you in October, and again in November. I received no answers. I was told there were none to receive." He paused. "I have recently been informed otherwise." She could not speak. She did not attempt to. "I asked a different question in those letters than the one answered on my behalf," he said. "I should like, with your permission, to ask it now in the correct direction." He was still looking at her, entirely and without remainder. "Will you do me the very great honor of allowing me to address myself to you, rather than to your family? And will you hear, in this room and before these witnesses, that I consider you to be worthy of every honor this house can offer?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object. It was a ring, a thin band set with a single pale stone, and beside it, between his fingers, was a folded piece of paper that she recognized without needing to open it. Because it was her own letter, the one she had written in October, in her own hand, with her father's seal. The letter that had been redirected and had arrived here after all, by some route she could not yet trace. "Your Grace," he said, and he said it to her, not as a form of address between supplicants, but as a name, as the name of the thing he was asking her to become. "If you will have me." The room held its breath. 31 people and the old household's weight held everything in place for 3 full seconds. Then Daniela Ashworth, who had been carrying linens and managing florists and returning cameo brooches and standing in corridors and being named a useful relation for 4 months, who had learned that silence was the price of endurance, and endurance was the shape her courage took when declaration was not available to her, said in a voice that was entirely steady, "I will." He rose. He was close enough that she could see the specific line of his jaw and the way his breathing had not quite returned to its measured depth. And the fact of his imperfect composure was the most honest thing she had seen all day. Lord Farwell said something. It did not carry. The Duke turned and looked at him once, and Farwell's confidence collapsed in a single visible moment, the way a candle goes out in a draught, completely and without warning. He folded the forged letter. He moved toward the door. He was not stopped, because stopping him was not necessary. He was simply no longer relevant to anything happening in the room. The room had turned, the way crowds turn when they have been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for a permission they were not able to give themselves. The baronet's wife said something to her husband in a low voice. 2 of the older guests exchanged a look that contained, between its 2 parts, an entire reassessment. Cecily sat very still, with the expression of a woman recalculating something she had believed settled. Not vengeful, not destroyed, only recalibrating against a reality she had not expected to encounter. Mrs. Eunice Ashworth's composure did not collapse loudly. It went the way things go when they have been maintained by effort rather than by substance, quietly, gradually, and with a kind of dignity that was in some way her most genuine quality of the evening. She looked at her elder daughter. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Agnes, who was watching her from the doorway with a steadiness that asked nothing and offered nothing, and simply stood there, as Agnes had stood there through all the preceding 4 months, carrying her knowledge and waiting for the room to be ready for it. "Edmund," one of the older guests said, using the name with the ease of long acquaintance, "I believe this calls for more champagne." The room remembered how to breathe. Someone laughed, not unkindly, and the sound broke the held surface of the evening and let the water underneath it run. You may tell this story to someone you love. It belongs to anyone who has ever stood in a corridor holding something they were told was not worth carrying. The summer passed quickly after that, the way time passes when its contents are too full to be processed at the rate they arrive. There was, in practical terms, a considerable amount of arrangement. The £4,000 of Ashworth debt was settled through the Duke's solicitor in 3 clean transactions before August, because Edmund had been aware of its existence since October and had been attempting, through the mechanism of his unanswered correspondence, to arrive at precisely this outcome via the honest route. The estate's contested question was resolved in the manner that contested estates are resolved when a Duke's solicitor brings sufficient documentation and patience to bear on the problem, which is to say, efficiently and without drama. There was a second ceremony at Carew Hall's chapel, small in early autumn, with Agnes among the witnesses and Mrs. Penworth's cameo brooch worn at the collar of a gown that was, for the first time in Daniela's recent memory, chosen for her rather than inherited or assigned. She stood at the altar in the chapel where her sister had stood 3 months before, and she did not feel the triumph she had been warned by novels to expect. She felt something quieter, a kind of settling. The sensation of a door closing on a room she had lived in for a long time, and the key turning cleanly in the lock. Edmund stood beside her with his hand still, and his face the specific stillness she had come to recognize as concentration rather than coldness, the expression of a man who is being very careful with something he values and does not intend to let carelessness cost him again. Agnes witnessed. She signed her name in the register with the steady hand of a woman who has been expecting to do so for some time. The autumn was warm, and then it was not, and by November the grounds of Carew Hall had turned brown and bare and beautiful in the way of things that do not require ornament. Daniela learned the house room by room, not as a person directed to its corners by necessity, but as a person walking through a place that was beginning to answer to her presence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, had made her own reassessment with the quiet efficiency of a woman who respected competence and was relieved to be in proximity to it. The long table in the dining hall seated its guests with more warmth than it had managed for some years. The wobble in the card table in the south drawing room was fixed, properly, by a carpenter brought in from the village, because Daniela had asked for this specifically, and with sufficient detail that the footman understood it was not a request likely to be forgotten. She asked Edmund one evening in October while they sat together in the library with the fire making its usual comments, why he had not written to her after November. He looked at the fire for a moment. "I was told," he said, "that you had accepted the arrangement on your family's behalf and found it satisfactory." That was the word used. Satisfactory. He was quiet. "I should have written again regardless. I chose to believe what I was told, which was easier than the alternative. And I have spent a considerable part of this year examining that choice." She looked at his profile in the firelight. And I was wrong to make it," he said. "The ease of a thing is not a sufficient recommendation." It was the most he had said about it directly, and she received it as he intended it, as a complete account rather than an excuse. She told him, that same evening, what Agnes had told her about the lake and the night 7 years ago, not because she wanted to press the wound, but because she thought he might find it easier to carry if she knew about it, and had not flinched. He was quiet for a long time after she said it. The fire settled. Outside, the first leaves were coming down in the dark. "I have not," he said at last, "spoken of it to anyone." He turned to look at her. She and I had not been easy together for some time. I was angry, and I left. and I should not have left, and I have known it every day since." He paused. "Carrying it is not the same as being defined by it. I am still learning the difference." "Yes," she said. "So am I." It was enough between them. It was, in fact, exactly sufficient. The first snow came in late November, earlier than usual, the kind of snow that arrives before the house is quite ready for it, and makes the grounds look like something illustrated rather than real. Daniela stood at the window of the upstairs hall and watched it come down in the particular silence that falling snow produces, a silence that is not absence, but a kind of fullness, the world's attention directed entirely inward. Beside her, Edmund had a short painting in his hands. It was a small oil portrait. Not a grand formal thing, but a working portrait. A man in his middle years, with an intelligent face, and the slightly distracted expression of someone who has agreed to sit still for longer than he finds comfortable. Daniela's father. The portrait that had been removed from the hall's hook during the wedding preparations and not returned. Agnes had found it in the storage room off the east wing, wrapped in a cloth, and had brought it to the Duke's study without comment, and placed it on his desk, and gone away. Edmund had brought it here. He hung it now on the hook in the hall. He was precise about it. The way he was precise about things that mattered to him. He stepped back and looked at it. "He trusted you," Daniela said. "He was right, too," Edmund said. "I was late in justifying it." "That is a different thing." She looked at her father's face in the portrait, at the small painted eyes that were the same shape as her own, at the half-formed expression that might have been concentration, or might have been the beginning of a smile. She had been told, by the painter who had done it, that her father had talked through the entire sitting, asking questions and proposing answers, and finding the world in general very interesting. She had been told this years ago, before the debts and the dying and the winter full of unanswered letters, when the world had been a place with more room in it. It had room again now. Different room. Room she had not known to expect, but room. Agnes appeared at the end of the hall, her white hair catching the pale window light, a cup of something hot in each hand, moving toward them with the unhurried gait of a woman entirely at home in this house, which was, in every way that mattered, exactly what she was. Outside, the snow kept falling on the grounds of Carew Hall, on the bare trees and the stone paths and the long flat sheet of the lake between the trees, covering everything equally, old grief and new beginning, and the small particular weight of a portrait restored to its hook. Daniela watched it and was warm.